What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. I told you guys on Tuesday when we did the video for the best picks in every round of your fantasy football drafts that we would also be doing the worst picks in every round, and that is what we are going to be doing today. So I don't want to waste any more time. Let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these ADPs. So just like we did in our last video, we're going to pull up the ADPs of each and every round. We'll talk about who the worst player is, and I will go through the ADPs for our audio-only listeners. If you're listening on Apple and Spotify, you guys will be able to hear who is in each of these rounds. And if you're not listening on Apple and Spotify and you want to listen on Apple and Spotify, go down in the link in the description. You can follow our shows over there. Now, looking at this first round, obviously the first round, there's not going to be bad players. There's not going to be the worst player, but for the sake of the video, we have to have the worst player. So I'll give you guys my ideas. Right here at the 101, we have Christian McCaffrey coming off the board, followed by CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson, Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, AJ Brown, Puka Nacua, Jonathan Taylor, and Jahmyr Gibbs. Now, like I said, not a bad player, but for me, the worst pick in this round of these great players is going to be Jonathan Taylor of the Indianapolis Colts. Now, really, I don't think there's anything that I dislike about Jonathan Taylor. It just comes down to cost and where I currently have him in my rankings. Now, looking at my rankings personally, I have guys like Garrett Wilson and Jahmyr Gibbs that I do have above Jonathan Taylor. So because of that, I guess he is the worst pick in this round for me because I technically have him as the 201 in my rankings. So he's going here at the 110. Probably should get him in the second round. If you take him at the 110, I don't mind. Like I said, great player, not much really to talk about, but because I currently have him as the 201 in my rankings, that's a player that I guess is the worst pick in the first round for me. So now that we got the easy one out of the way, let's move on to round two. We'll look at this ADP right now. Starting at the 201, we have Saquon Barkley coming off the board, and he's followed by Garrett Wilson, Marvin Harrison Jr., Kyron Williams, Devontae Adams, Derrick Henry, Chris Olave, Drake London, Travis Etienne, Isaiah Pacheco, Sam LaPorta, and Travis Kelce. Now, the worst pick in this round for me is going to be Sam LaPorta of the Detroit Lions, and really, you look at the rookie season that he had, it was absolutely incredible. I think he's definitely earned the crown to be crowned the Dynasty tight end one, but you look at the redraft ADP and it just doesn't really make a ton of sense to me. Back in 2023, he had 120 targets, 86 receptions, 889 receiving yards, and 10 touchdowns. That was averaging 14.1 fantasy points per game, good for the third overall tight end there. And the reality is, at the current cost and the current ADP right now, going in the second round, you have to be elite. And I think Sam LaPorta is elite, but not that much more elite than guys like Mark Andrews, Trey McBride, Dalton Kincaid that are going 2 rounds later in ADP. So this is a guy that you have to reach on very early. You have to make your flag stamp, and you kind of have to hope that he doesn't have any type of touchdown regression here in year 2, because those 10 touchdowns, that was quite a bit of touchdowns for a rookie tight end. So even though I think Sam LaPorta is a beast, I love Sam LaPorta, I want him on all of my dynasty teams if I can get him at an affordable cost, but in your redraft leagues, this is not an affordable cost to draft him. I think for this reason as well, I'm probably not drafting a ton of Travis Kelce, who is also in this round. I'm more likely going to go into that next tier of tight ends, like I said, in the 4th round, Mark Andrews, Trey McBride, Dalton Kincaid. That's just a more affordable cost, and I'm not willing to spend high-end top 24 draft pick capital on a onesie position like the tight end, especially if I'm not in a tight end premium league. Now, moving on to round 3 here, we do have the ADP kicking it off at the 301 with Devon Achane, followed by Mike Evans, Nico Collins, Josh Allen, Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, Jalen Waddle, Jalen Hurts, Josh Jacobs, Michael Pittman Jr., Patrick Mahomes, and Cooper Kupp. So that kind of sums up our 3rd round. For me, I think the worst pick in this round and the pick that I'm least likely to draft of this group of guys is going to be Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers. Now, Jacobs is coming off of a 2023 season where he had 233 rushing attempts. He rushed for 805 yards, and he had 6 total touchdowns. So not the best year for Josh Jacobs there in Las Vegas. Now, obviously, he got to hit the open market. He finds himself in Green Bay. They gave him a pretty decent contract, and now he's going to be in this backfield here for the Packers. Now, currently in my rankings, I have Josh Jacobs as the running back 15. You see on this ADP, he's coming off the board as the running back 12. Now, that would make Josh Jacobs a 4th round pick for me in my ADP. So this is the guy that I think is probably the worst pick in that round because of that. And looking back at the last couple of seasons for Josh Jacobs, obviously he had his best years from 2020 to 2022. During that time with the Raiders, he was giving us those running back 1 numbers, and he even had a running back 3 overall finish during the 2022 season. Now, oftentimes when running backs switch teams like this later in their career, it doesn't necessarily pan out a lot of the time. I also think that there's enough yellow and orange flags with Josh Jacobs' season last year that kind of give me a little bit of worry as we look at 2024 and beyond for Jacobs. And what those flags are is that he's lost a lot of the efficiency that he used to run with. You also look at how Josh Jacobs has been productive, and it's mainly been volume. He's gotten a ton of volume over his time in Las Vegas, and now he goes to a backfield here in Green Bay where he has a little bit more competition than he's really ever had. A.J. Dillon, Marshawn Lloyd, both running backs in this backfield that should see some touches here in 2024. And even though I do think that there is a pathway for Josh Jacobs to be successful and maybe get into that running back one type of numbers, it is going to have to take for him to get into the end zone quite a bit this year. Probably 12 to 14-ish touchdowns will give him that RB1 production. If you think he can hit that, maybe he's not a bad pick. I don't know if he can hit that, and I don't know if he's going to get the volume and the efficiencies that we want to see for him to have those big spike weeks without the touchdown production. And even with that being said, there are some running backs later that could be a better value for you if you are drafting a guy as your running back 2, which I do think Josh Jacobs should be considered your running back 2. There's guys like Joe Mixon, James Cook, Rashad White. They're going later in rounds that I do think are better picks than Josh Jacobs. Now, looking at round 4, we do have an ADP starting at the 401 of DJ Moore, followed by Rashad White, DK Metcalf, Devontae Smith, James Cook, Lamar Jackson, Stephon Diggs, Joe Mixon, Mark Andrews, Trey McBride, Kenneth Walker, and Dalton Kincaid. Now, this round has a ton of running back value that I like. Obviously, the last round, I think you probably should rather go with a wide receiver, and here's where you take that running back too, like I mentioned. But I do think that there is one running back that sticks out that I just don't really like, and that player is going to be Kenneth Walker of the Seattle Seahawks. Now, Walker's kind of a player that I really can't get behind at his current cost. Really, if it's a Dynasty League, Redraft League, Best Ball League, I just can't get behind Kenneth Walker for some reason. Now, Walker's been fine throughout his career. I mean, you look at what he's been consistently averaging from a fantasy points per game standpoint. He's averaged about 13.4 fantasy points per game over his 2-year career. And that fantasy points per game average would kind of put him around that running back 18 mark for the majority of his career. Now, it does worry me a little bit that we are going to be moving from a Pete Carroll run-heavy type of offense into a Ryan Grubb-led pass-heavy type of offense here in Seattle, and that kind of worries me for Kenneth Walker because he hasn't necessarily been a pass catcher or a good receiver throughout the majority of his career, even at the college level. And it's especially worrisome when you have a running back on the roster like Zach Charbonnet, who does profile as a much better pass catcher. Now, if we get into a situation where Zach Charbonnet is playing third downs, he's playing passing downs and things like that, that could make Kenneth Walker a good, not great running back 2 for our lineups, which is fine, I guess, at the draft cost, but there really is no upside in a player like that unless he scores a ton of touchdowns. Now, he's going to give you those running back 2 weeks, he's going to give you those running back 1 spike weeks when he does get into the end zone, but in the PPR leagues, he's not going to have a ton of appeal, and it could very likely be a somewhat of a committee split in this backfield here in Seattle. Now, I do think that there are a lot better picks that you can make instead of Kenneth Walker. I mean, I look at some of the wide receivers in this round and even some of the wide receivers in the round afterwards that I'd much rather have than a guy like Kenneth Walker. Guys like T. Higgins, George Pickens, Amari Cooper, Tank Dell, any of those guys, plus the guys that we had in this round of Trey McBride, Mark Andrews, Dalton Kincaid, that I mentioned are better tight end picks than what Kenneth Walker can provide you for your fantasy football roster. So let's move on to round 5 here. Looking at the ADP coming off the board at the 501, we have the rookie hard knock sensation, yada yada, Malik Neighbors of the New York Giants. Now at the 502, we have CJ Stroud, Amari Cooper, Zay Flowers, Alvin Kamara, Tank Dell, Anthony Richardson, T. Higgins, George Pickens, Kyle Pitts, George Kittle, and Christian Kirk. Now, I kind of struggled in this round. There was actually a couple players that I was looking at, and I'm like, man, are they the worst pick, or is this guy the worst pick? There's a couple guys that I think have some red flags. Now, the player that I ended up settling on was Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. And there's a few things that really worry me about Zay Flowers currently at this ADP. You look at the 2023 season, and obviously he had a pretty decent rookie season, 108 targets, 77 receptions, 858 yards, and 5 touchdowns. And on the year, he averaged about 12.9 fantasy points per game, which was good for the 31st overall wide receiver. Now, the red flag to a guy like Zay Flowers is last year he finished as the wide receiver 31 from a fantasy points per game, as I mentioned, but the majority of Zay Flowers' production came when Mark Andrews was not on the football field. Zay Flowers had 6 finishes in the top 24 wide receivers last year, and 5 of those 6 came when Mark Andrews was injured or not in the starting lineup. And in the other 10 games that Zay Flowers played with Mark Andrews on the field, he only finished as a top 24 wide receiver in 1 of those 10 games. So there is a lot of red flags to see here when Mark Andrews is on the field with Zay Flowers. I think if Zay Flowers is going to pay off at this current ADP, he has to establish himself as a true receiving threat in this offense alongside a guy like Mark Andrews. And I just don't believe that that can really happen because, one, he doesn't profile as a true alpha type of wide receiver that can establish himself, and you have to account for the addition of Derrick Henry in this offense, which could mean that they just really run the football more than they ever have in years past when they had guys like Gus Edwards, injured J.K. Dobbins, Justice Hill, and those guys in the backfield. So with likely some more rushing attempts out of Baltimore and Mark Andrews back on the field, Zay Flowers, for me, he's kind of a fade at this ADP. Now moving on to our round 6, starting it off at the 601, you have David Montgomery off the board, followed by Aaron Jones, Joe Burrow, Evan Engram, Terry McLaurin, Keenan Allen, Dak Prescott, James Conner, Zamir White, Ramondre Stevenson, Kyler Murray, and Calvin Ridley. Now there is another player in this round that I just don't draft in any of my drafts. I've been doing a lot of these underdog best ball drafts, as you know. Every time I am on the clock and he is on the board, I just don't draft him, and that is going to be Zamir White for the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, there are a few issues with his profile and his draft cost that just make this an issue for me. I mean, for starters, looking at the running backs that are going behind him right now, there's guys that I just simply like better than Zamir White. Guys like James Conner, Najee Harris, and DeAndre Swift, who I just think have more upside than a guy like Zamir White in your lineup. And the other thing is really that Zamir White doesn't offer much pass-catching upside in an offense like this, and that's going to cap his upside in those PPR leagues. And you also think about the Las Vegas Raiders. We don't expect them to win a ton of games this year. We don't expect them to be leading in a ton of games this year. So the rushing attempts could actually come down. And looking at 2023, you see that this Raiders team was a bottom 6 team in rushing attempts. So if Zamir White's not getting work on third down, if he's not catching a ton of footballs, and if they're trailing in a bunch of games, the touchdown upside will be limited, the pass catching upside will be limited, and he's going to become one of those early down grinders that really just doesn't perform and doesn't have the upside that you need out of a running back on your roster. Now, although we expect him to get a ton of volume early on, especially like he was getting in the back half of the year last year, I just feel like this is a guy who's going to give you those mid-range RB2 numbers, really like he was doing from a week-to-week basis in 2023, but you really won't get anything else out of Zamir White, so I'm good passing on him in this round. Now, moving on to the 7th round here, we have the ADP kicking it off at the 701 of Jaden Reed, followed by Chris Godwin, DeAndre Swift, Najee Harris, Hollywood Brown, Jordan Love, Raheem Mostert, Rashee Rice, Jonathon Brooks, Deontay Johnson, Jake Ferguson, and David Njoku. Now, the worst pick in this round for me is going to be Jonathon Brooks, the running back for the Carolina Panthers, and really it just comes down to one thing. Jonathon Brooks was most people's RB1 in this year's rookie class, and rightfully so. He has some dual threat ability, and he has that home run hitting type of speed, but he did suffer a late season ACL tear in November last year for the Texas Longhorns, and so because of that, he's likely going to be starting off this year on the PUP. I mean, he's already on it right now, but week 1's just a few weeks away, so I don't really know if he's going to be available to start the season. Now, with that being said, this is a player who could have a solid second half of the year if he recovers fine from the ACL and there is no wear and tear, but on draft day, this is a guy that I'm likely avoiding. I'll let one of my league mates draft him, and if I can trade for him in a couple of weeks when maybe they've lost a couple of games and they can't wait on Jonathon Brooks anymore, that's more likely what I will do if I'm going to be acquiring Jonathon Brooks on my lineups. But there's much more competent and capable players in this round or in even the next round where you're going to get more production from them probably over the first month or maybe even the first 2 months of the season, where you can go get Jonathon Brooks later, cheaper probably in the trade room. Now, looking at round 8 here, kicking it off at the 801, we have DeAndre Hopkins come off the board, followed by Tony Pollard, Jordan Addison, Jalen Warren, Zach Moss, Rome Odunze, Ladd McConkey, Christian Watson, Brock Purdy, Brian Robinson, Xavier Worthy, and Austin Ekeler. Now, again, there's a clear player in this round for me that is the worst pick, and this might be a little bit of a cop-out because he's coming off the board at the 812, but we are talking about Austin Ekeler, and obviously he signed a new 2-year deal for $8.4 million with the Washington Commanders this offseason, so he is now going to be in this new system, but he's coming off of a very forgettable 2023 season where he only had 628 rushing yards, 436 receiving yards, and 6 total touchdowns, which is a massive regression from what he's posted in years past, and it's hard for me to look at what Austin Ekeler did in 2023 and not think that he's been hit by the running back age cliff. Now, again, the big thing for me is the regression. We saw a massive regression in touchdowns, but not only the touchdowns, we also saw his lowest rushing attempts numbers, the rushing yards, receptions, receiving yard numbers. All of these were lows since 2020. He also posted a career low in yards per carry, just showing us that he really doesn't have that much juice left in the tank. Now, you pair this with the fact that now he is probably the running back 2 on the depth chart, playing behind Brian Robinson, who will be the early down grinder, and he's going to be playing on an offense with the rookie quarterback that has rushing upside and is less likely to check down the football. It kind of just makes Austin Ekeler a can't draft, can't touch, don't really want him. That's kind of the player that Austin Ekeler has become to me now at this point in his career. career, and I would be shocked probably if I draft any Austin Ekeler ever anymore, probably for the majority of his career. Now moving on to round 9 here, kicking it off at the 901, we have Jackson Smith and Jigba, followed by Javonte Williams, Jaden Daniels, Tajay Spears, Brock Bowers, Devin Singletary, Nick Chubb, Keon Coleman, Tua Tagovailoa, Brian Thomas Jr., Cortland Sutton, and Dallas Goedert. Now I kind of debated between a few picks in this round as well. There's guys like Brock Bowers, who I'm really not big on drafting this year as a rookie. There's also guys like Keon Coleman that I'm not a huge believer in, but obviously I see the opportunity. Guys that are unexciting like Cortland Sutton and Dallas Goedert. But to me, unfortunately, I do think that the worst pick is going to be Nick Chubb of the Cleveland Browns. Now let's just get this out of the way. I say unfortunately because I love Nick Chubb. I'm actually a big fan of Nick Chubb. I think Nick Chubb is fantastic when he's healthy. And I'm rooting for Nick Chubb to kind of defy the odds and bounce back to form after that gruesome knee injury that he suffered about 8 months ago. But that knee injury, it took multiple surgeries and he's still recovering from it today. So that makes this kind of a bad pick for me. Now there's enough yellow flags that make me nervous for Nick Chubb despite the injury. You just throw the injury on top of that and that's what kind of makes him the worst pick for me in this round. But you also look at Nick Chubb's age. He's 29 years old, or he's going to be 29 this season, and he has almost 2,000 carries of career mileage on those legs. Those are carries from the college and the NFL level, and 2,000 is a ton for a running back, especially a running back that runs hard and physical like Nick Chubb. That alone makes me very nervous, but you also have to account for an offensive coordinator change in Cleveland this year as well. They've moved on from Alex Van Pelt, who has very efficient rushing offenses over the majority of his career, and they move on to Ken Dorsey, formerly of the Buffalo Bills, and he kind of has a more pass-heavy approach in his offensive play style. Now, I've been vocal about my concerns for Nick Chubb's availability over the course of the offseason, especially in Dynasty formats where I was saying we should go buy Jerome Ford for cheap. I still think you can draft Jerome Ford for cheap in your redraft leagues. And just one more side note for a minor yellow flag for Nick Chubb as well is he has seen his YPC, that yards per carry, come down just a little bit every single season over the last 3 years. So that's something to monitor as well as the injury and some of the other stuff with Nick Chubb. Now going on to our final round here for the day, we will talk about round 10, kicking it off at the 10:01. We have Gus Edwards of the Los Angeles Chargers. Then you have Jameson Williams, Trey Benson, Jared Goff, Ezekiel Elliott, Caleb Williams, TJ Hawkinson, Tyler Lockett, Justin Herbert, Blake Corum, Chase Brown, and Trevor Lawrence. Now, I think the worst pick in this round is going to be that number 1 pick in this round, Gus Edwards of the Los Angeles Chargers. And last year for the Baltimore Ravens, Gus Edwards was actually the full-time starter for the majority of the year because J.K. Dobbins missed the entire season. And during that time as the starter, Edwards, he averaged about 11 fantasy points per game, which was good for the running back, 32 on a points per game basis, and that's just about where he's being drafted in this year's ADP as well. Now we look at the change that he has. He's going from Baltimore to the Los Angeles Chargers. We probably expect this to be a little bit of a worse team. We know the receiving options aren't as good here. We know they're kind of a new head coach. They want to establish the run. The reality is there's probably going to be less touchdown opportunities in Los Angeles than there were in Baltimore, and last year that's kind of the bread and butter of Gus Edwards. He had 13 touchdowns on the year. And not only that, but Gus Edwards also has zero type of pass catching ability. I mean, you look, last year was his career high in receptions and he had 12. You and I, we could go on a football field and catch 12 passes over the course of the season. And lastly, you also look at the efficiency that he had. The efficiency dropped last year for Gus Edwards as well. We know he's a little bit older, but he went from about 5 yards per carry down to 1. So not like it's a massive gap, but 5 to 1, that's 1 extra yard every single run. It's going to add up over the course of the season. Now, although he has very minimal competition in Los Angeles this year, it's actually similar competition to what he had last year. J.K. Dobbins and rookie Kamani Vidal, which I guess you could compare to the rookie that they had last year in Keaton Mitchell. Not that they're the same type of player, but similar type of situation for Gus Edwards. But I think if J.K. Dobbins was healthy last year, this would have been a much more committee approach type of deal for the Ravens. I think it's going to be a committee approach here in Los Angeles this year. And it's also worth monitoring right now that Gus Edwards is missing some time in training camp. And in training camp, J.K. Dobbins is seeing those first team reps while Gus Edwards is out. And that's because Gus Edwards had a undisclosed surgery during the offseason to fix something up. We don't really know what it is at this point, but it's definitely something worth monitoring as we get closer and closer to the season. So there you guys have it. The worst pick in every round. I don't usually love doing the negative videos, but if we're going to do the best, we got to do the worst. I think it's a good contrast to each other. So if you did enjoy the video, or if you disagree with me or agree with me, let me know in the comments down below and hit that like button. It is the best free way to show this channel some support. Also, make sure you guys are subscribed to this channel on YouTube. Make sure you go listen on Apple and Spotify if you would like to do so. And last but not least, make sure you go join our Discord. We are going to be doing a Dynasty trade review show later on Monday of next week. So if you want to have your Dynasty trades reviewed, it is free to join that Discord. Just go in there, go to the Dynasty trade channel and submit those Dynasty fantasy football trades. So with all of that being said, I have nothing else for you guys today. So we will see you guys in our next video. But until then, peace out.